welcome. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Or, I might show up at your door. I'm just here to share some creepy stories, so sit back and enjoy. Disclaimer: the content presented in the video is purely for entertainment purposes only. The theories and stories discussed in this video are speculative and are not supported by any evidence or proof. Viewer discretion is advised. Day 1. I've been guiding tours through Seattle's underground for 6 years, and I've never seen anything like what happened today. The familiar musty smell of century-old foundations mixed with something else. Something metallic and wrong that made my teeth ache. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because someone needs to document this before it gets worse. My name is Jeremy Leduc, and I make my living showing people the bones of old Seattle. The city that burned in 1889, buried under tons of fill dirt and forgotten. Most days, it's just history and ghost stories for camera-clicking tourists. Today, the ghosts started bleeding. The morning tour group was typical 12 people, half of them teenagers dragged along by parents who'd read about the underground in some guidebook. We descended through the familiar entrance on Pioneer Square, our flashlights cutting through the perpetual twilight of the subterranean passages. The brick walls stretched ahead of us, stained with decades of moisture and neglect. These tunnels, I told them in my practiced tour guide voice, were once the ground floor of Seattle's business district. When the city regraded in the 1890s, they simply built over the old structures, creating this maze of, that's when I saw it, a thin trickle of dark liquid seeping through the mortar between two bricks, about shoulder height on the eastern wall. At first glance, it looked like rust stains from old pipes, but something about its consistency was wrong. Too thick, too red. "Is that blood?" asked one of the teenagers, pointing at the same spot. I forced a laugh. "Just mineral deposits from groundwater. Iron oxide creates that reddish color." But as I stepped closer with my flashlight, the beam revealed something that made my stomach clench. The liquid was moving, flowing in a steady stream that pooled on the uneven floor. Fresh, warm, judging by the faint steam rising from it. "Keep moving, everyone," I said, guiding them past the spot. But I couldn't shake the image from my mind. The way the liquid caught the light, the almost pulsing rhythm of its flow, like a heartbeat made visible. The tour continued through the familiar stations. The old bank vault, the hotel basement, the remnants of the sidewalk system. But I found myself distracted, my practice spiel stumbling over words I'd spoken 1,000 times, because I kept noticing more stains, more seepage, dark patches on the walls that hadn't been there yesterday, or the day before, or any day in the 6 years I'd been walking these tunnels. After depositing the tourists back at street level, I returned to the underground alone. The silence down there is different from surface quiet, heavier, pressing against your eardrums like water. I made my way back to the eastern wall, my flashlight beam dancing across the brick and mortar. The trickle had become a steady flow. I reached out to touch it, then pulled my hand back. My grandfather's voice echoed in my memory, words from his journals that I'd read as a child. "Never trust the earth when it bleeds, Jeremy. The foundations remember what we try to forget." Grandpa Pierre had been Seattle's unofficial historian before the city ever paid people like me to do it. He documented every tunnel, every basement, every forgotten corner of the underground. His journals filled 3 leather-bound volumes, packed with maps, sketches, and observations that read more like warnings than historical records. I'd inherited them when he died, along with his obsession with the city's hidden spaces. Standing in that tunnel, watching blood, because that's what it was, I was certain now, seep from century-old walls, I finally understood why his journals always felt like horror stories. I pulled out my phone and called my cousin Samuel, who works maintenance for the city. If anyone would know about water line breaks or structural issues, it would be him. "Sam, it's Jeremy. I'm in the underground tunnels, and there's something leaking through the walls. Dark red liquid, coming from multiple spots. Old pipes, probably," he said, but I could hear the concern in his voice. "I'll check the city systems tomorrow, see if there are any reported breaks in that area." "It's not pipes, Sam. This is coming directly through the brick." A pause. "I'll be right over." While I waited, I explored deeper into the tunnel system, following passages that weren't part of the regular tour route. The seepage was everywhere now. Not just small trickles, but steady streams that converged into dark pools on the uneven floor. The metallic smell grew stronger, mixed with something organic that made my throat burn. That's when I found the first symbols, carved into the wall at the intersection of two tunnels. Just above a particularly heavy flow of the red liquid were markings I didn't recognize. Not the usual graffiti or historical markers, but something older. Deep gouges in the brick, forming angular patterns that seemed to writhe in the shifting light of my flashlight. The liquid flowed directly over them, as if the symbols themselves were bleeding. I pulled out my phone and took pictures, though the images came out blurry, distorted by some trick of the light. Then I heard footsteps echoing from the main tunnel, Sam's heavy work boots on the old wooden planks. "Jesus Christ, Jeremy," he said when he saw the pools of liquid. "This isn't water damage. This is..." He knelt beside one of the larger pools, careful not to touch it. "This is blood." "I know, human blood. I know." We stared at each other across the crimson pool, and I saw in his eyes the same realization that was crystallizing in my own mind. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a broken pipe or a structural failure. This was something else entirely. "We need to call the police," Sam said. "And tell them what? That the underground is bleeding. Tell them there's been a crime. Multiple crimes. This much blood." He gestured at the pools around us. "People are dead, Jeremy." But even as he spoke, I was thinking about Grandpa Pierre's journals, about his warnings regarding the foundations, about the strange symbols carved into the bleeding walls. This wasn't the aftermath of violence. This was the beginning of something far worse. "We need to evacuate the area," I said. "Get everyone out of the square above us." "Based on what?" "Some red liquid in the tunnels." Before I could answer, the walls began to hum. It started as a low vibration, barely perceptible, like a distant subway train. But the sound grew deeper, more resonant, until the brick itself seemed to be singing. The liquid flows increased, becoming steady streams that cascaded from higher portions of the walls. The metallic smell intensified, mixed now with something that reminded me of ozone before a thunderstorm. "We need to go," Sam said, backing toward the main tunnel. "Now." I followed him, but not before taking one last look at the carved symbols. In the wavering light of my flashlight, they seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the humming walls. And for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw something else. A faint glow emanating from the deepest gouges, like coals buried in ash. We climbed back to street level in silence, emerging into the ordinary bustle of Pioneer Square. Tourists walked past, oblivious to what flowed beneath their feet. Street musicians played for scattered crowds. Life continued as if the world hadn't just cracked open and started bleeding. But I knew better. Whatever was happening in the underground, whatever those symbols meant, this was just the beginning. The foundations were remembering, just like Grandpa Pierre had warned. And Seattle was about to learn what it had tried so hard to forget. Tonight, I'm going to read his journals again. All of them. Because tomorrow, I have a feeling the bleeding is going to get worse. Day 2 emergency journal entry. The streets ran red, and something vast stirred beneath the asphalt. I didn't sleep last night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those symbols carved into the bleeding walls, pulsing with that sickly glow. But nothing in Grandpa Pierre's journals prepared me for what happened this morning. I was back in the underground by 6 a.m., before the first tour group arrived. The blood flow had tripled overnight. What had been thin trickles yesterday were now steady streams cascading down the walls, pooling in the low spots and running along the old drainage channels. The metallic smell was overwhelming, thick enough to taste, coating my throat like copper dust. The humming had never stopped. I followed the sound deeper into the tunnel system, past the tourist routes and into sections that hadn't seen visitors in decades. The walls here were older, built from stone blocks instead of brick, and the blood flowed more freely. It wasn't just seeping anymore. It was gushing from cracks between the stones, as if the earth itself had burst an artery. That's when I found the first ward, carved into a supporting beam near the old hotel basement, barely visible under layers of grime and moisture, were symbols I recognized from Grandpa Pierre's journals. Not the angular markings that seemed to channel the blood, but something else, protective symbols he'd called them. Wards against the old hunger that sleeps beneath the city. I pulled out my phone and called Sam again, but it went straight to voicemail. The cell towers must have been having issues because I couldn't get a signal anywhere in the tunnels. The emergency radio on my belt crackled with static, occasionally picking up fragments of what sounded like panicked voices. Multiple ruptures in the storm drain system, flooding in the financial district. Not water, repeat. This is not water. I climbed back to street level and Pioneer Square was chaos. Blood was erupting from manholes across the square like crimson geysers, shooting 10 feet into the air before crashing back down to stain the cobblestones. The storm drains were overflowing, sending rivers of viscous red liquid streaming down the streets. People screamed and ran, slipping on the slick pavement, their shoes and clothes stained with whatever was pouring out of the earth. I spotted Sam near the northeast corner of the square, in his city maintenance uniform, shouting into his radio. I pushed through the crowd of fleeing tourists and grabbed his arm. Sam, what's happening? The entire underground system is compromised. He yelled over the noise of another geyser erupting nearby. Not just the tourist tunnels, the storm drains, the old utility passages, everything. It's like the whole foundation is bleeding out. Is it connected to the power grid? Water mains? Nothing's connected to anything. His eyes were wide with panic. This isn't coming from our systems, Jeremy. This is coming from deeper, much deeper. Another geyser erupted from a manhole 20 feet away, and I saw something in the spray that made my blood freeze. The liquid wasn't just red, it was moving, writhing, as if something alive was mixed in with the blood, something that pulsed and twisted in the falling droplets. We need to get people out of here, I said, but Sam was already moving, herding confused tourists toward the side streets. I ran back to the underground entrance, but the stairs were flooded. The blood was rising, pouring up from the lower levels in a steady tide. I could hear the humming even up here, vibrating through the sidewalk beneath my feet. The sound was different now, deeper, more urgent, like a massive heart beating faster and faster. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The corporate building, basement level. Now, a friend. I showed it to Sam when he came back, but he just shook his head. We've got bigger problems. The mayor's office is organizing an evacuation. They're saying it's a burst water main, but it's not water. No, it's not. I looked around the square, watching people flee through ankle-deep streams of blood. The tourist shops were closing their doors, owners standing behind windows with expressions of horror and disbelief. The street musicians had abandoned their instruments, now stained red and silent. I need to check something, I told Sam. There's a corporate building on First Avenue that might be connected to this. Jeremy, no. We need to stick together. This isn't the time for one of your historical investigations. But I was already moving, pulling out Grandpa Pierre's journals from my backpack. I'd brought them with me, hoping they might provide some insight into what was happening. As I flipped through the pages, looking for references to corporate buildings or basement levels, one entry caught my attention. The hunger grows stronger near the places of power. Where men gather to trade in secrets and influence, the old foundations remember their purpose. The wards must be maintained, or the city will feed the darkness that waits below. The building on First Avenue was Meridian Technologies, a tech company that had moved into one of the restored historical buildings 5 years ago. I'd never paid much attention to it before, but now I remembered something odd. During the renovation, they'd sealed off the basement level, claiming structural instability. No tours, no access, not even for the historical society. I made my way through the chaos, following the stream of blood that seemed to flow in that direction. The closer I got to the Meridian building, the stronger the humming became. It wasn't just coming from the storm drains anymore. It was emanating from the building itself, thrumming through the walls and windows. The lobby was empty except for a security guard who looked like he'd seen a ghost. Blood was seeping through the elevator doors, pooling on the marble floor in spreading crimson lakes. "You need to evacuate," I told him, but he just pointed toward the basement stairs. "It's coming from down there," he whispered. "We tried to seal it off, but it won't stop. The whole building is." He trailed off, staring at the blood now flowing down the main staircase like a waterfall. That's when I heard the screaming, not from the street, from below, from the basement level that was supposed to be sealed off. Human voices, distorted by distance and acoustics, crying out in what sounded like agony or ecstasy. It was impossible to tell which. I thought about the message on my phone, about Grandpa Pierre's warnings, about the protective wards carved into the tunnel beams. I thought about my duty to warn people, to document what was happening, to preserve some record of the truth. But most of all, I thought about the tourists who trusted me to show them the safe, sanitized version of Seattle's underground. The families who had no idea that their city was built on something that was now waking up, hungry and angry after more than a century of sleep. The blood was rising faster now, reaching the lobby level. Soon it would overflow onto the street, joining the rivers already flowing through Pioneer Square. The humming was becoming a roar, and I could feel vibrations through the soles of my feet that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock beneath the city. Whatever was happening in that basement, whatever the Meridian building was really hiding, I knew I had to see it. Because if I didn't, if I ran with everyone else, then no one would be left to warn the world about what was coming. The old hunger was waking up, and Seattle was about to find out what it had been feeding all these years. Day 2. The corporation's basement wasn't an office. It was a temple carved in blood. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to flee with the other evacuees, to get as far from Pioneer Square as possible. But I descended those blood-slicked stairs into the Meridian building's basement, following the inhuman screaming that echoed from below. Someone had to witness what was happening. Someone had to survive to tell the truth. The basement level was a maze of server rooms and utility closets, or at least that's what it appeared to be. But as I followed the flow of blood through the corridors, my flashlight beam caught details that made my skin crawl. The walls were covered with the same angular symbols I'd seen in the tunnels, but these were different, deeper, more elaborate, carved directly into the concrete and filled with what looked like dried blood and bone fragments. The humming was deafening down here, vibrating through my chest cavity and making my teeth ache. I could feel it in my bones, a rhythm that matched no human heartbeat. The blood on the floor was inches deep, flowing in channels that had been carved into the concrete to form intricate patterns. Ritual circles, I realized, summoning diagrams. That's when I met Austin Chevalier. He emerged from a side corridor, his business suit stained with blood, his hands shaking as he clutched a leather-bound journal. At first I thought he was another victim, but when he spoke, I recognized the voice from the phone call. "You're Jeremy Leduc," he said. It wasn't a question. "The tour guide. You know the tunnels. Who are you?" "Austin Chevalier. I am their ritual specialist. Or I was, until I saw what they really intended." He gestured toward the blood-carved symbols on the walls. "I sent you that message. I've been trying to find someone who might understand what's happening. What is this place?" Meridian Technologies isn't a tech company. It's a front for something much older. They've been preparing this ritual for decades, using the company's expansion to map and access the underground systems. Every building renovation, every infrastructure project, they were placing ritual anchors throughout the city's foundation. As he spoke, I noticed the journal in his hands. The leather binding was identical to Grandpa Pierre's, but the symbols pressed into the cover were different, the same angular markings that covered the walls around us. "My grandfather wrote about protective wards," I said. Symbols to keep something at bay. Austin nodded grimly. The wards were placed by the original settlers, people who knew what slept beneath Seattle's hills. But the corporation found ways to circumvent them, to corrupt them. Every time the city expanded, they weakened the barriers. A distant explosion shook the building, and fresh blood began streaming through cracks in the ceiling. The screaming from deeper in the basement intensified, multiple voices now, chanting in a language that hurt to hear. We need to stop them, I said. It's too late for that. The ritual is already in motion, but there might be a way to disrupt it, to break the summoning circle before. He was cut off by a sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. Footsteps. Heavy, wet footsteps coming from the direction of the chanting. But these weren't human footsteps. They squelched with each step, like something massive moving through deep mud. They're coming, Austin whispered. The first spawn. The blood has reached critical mass. I grabbed his arm. Where's the main ritual site? Sub-basement. 3 levels down. But Jeremy, you don't understand. Once the creatures emerge, they'll spread through the underground system. Every tunnel, every storm drain, every basement in the city will become a breeding ground. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by a sound like wet leather dragging across concrete. I could smell something new mixing with the metallic blood scent. Something rotten and organic, like meat left too long in the sun. Show me, I said. Austin led me through a maze of corridors, past rooms filled with server equipment that I now realized were actually monitoring stations for the ritual sites throughout the city. Computer screens showed feeds from underground cameras, displaying blood flows and ritual progress at dozens of locations. The scope of it was overwhelming. This wasn't just about Pioneer Square or even downtown Seattle. They had been preparing to turn the entire underground into a summoning ground. We reached a service elevator that descended far below the building's official basement level. The blood here was deeper, reaching past our ankles, and it moved with a current that suggested vast spaces below. The elevator descended through darkness, past levels that shouldn't exist, until it opened onto a cavern that stretched beyond the reach of my flashlight. The sub-basement was a natural cave system, but it had been modified with carved channels and raised platforms. At the center stood an altar the size of a small building, carved from black stone and covered with symbols that seemed to writhe in the flickering light of torches mounted on the walls. The altar was covered in blood, not just surface stains, but deep pools that reflected the torchlight like mirrors. Around the altar, figures in business suits chanted in that inhuman language, their voices echoing off the cavern walls. But they weren't alone. Moving between them were things that had once been human, transformed by the ritual into something else. Their skin was pale and translucent, revealing networks of black veins beneath. Their eyes were solid black, and when they opened their mouths to join the chanting, I could see rows of needle-sharp teeth. The spawn, Austin breathed. They're using the corporate employees as vessels. The blood transforms them, makes them part of the summoning. As we watched, one of the transformed figures approached the altar and pressed its hands against the stone. The symbols flared with sickly light, and the blood began to flow faster, pouring from channels in the walls like waterfalls. The chanting grew louder, more urgent, and I could feel the vibration in my chest intensify. We need to destroy the altar, I said. With what? That stone is older than the city, older than the first human settlements. It's been waiting here for centuries, feeding on the city's growth. But I was already moving, pulling Grandpa Pierre's journals from my backpack. I flipped through the pages, looking for the protective symbols, the wards that had kept this thing contained for so long. If the corporation had found ways to corrupt the barriers, maybe there was a way to reverse the process. Here, I said, pointing to a page filled with diagrams. These are counter-ritual symbols. If we can carve them into the altar.
Jeremy, no.
If you get close to that thing, you'll be transformed like the others. The blood in the air is already changing you. Can't you feel it? He was right. My skin was tingling, and there was a metallic taste in my mouth that wasn't just from the smell. The blood was working its way into my system, trying to make me part of the ritual. But I also felt something else, a resistance, a protection that I didn't understand. My grandfather's wards, I realized. He didn't just document them, he carved them into me. I rolled up my sleeve, revealing scars on my forearm that I'd carried since childhood. Grandpa Pierre had told me they were from an accident, but now I could see the pattern. The same protective symbols from his journals, carved into my flesh and healed over. He had prepared me for this, even if he hadn't known when or how it would happen. I can get close to the altar, I said, but I need time to carve the counter symbols. Austin nodded grimly. I'll create a distraction. Try to disrupt the chanting long enough for you to work. Before I could stop him, he was running toward the altar, shouting in the same inhuman language as the chanters. The transformed figures turned toward him, their black eyes reflecting the torchlight. Austin pulled something from his jacket, a small explosive device, I realized, and threw it at one of the supporting pillars. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space. Rock and debris rained down, and several of the chanters were caught in the collapse. But the altar remained intact, and the remaining figures turned their attention to Austin with murderous intent. I ran toward the altar as Austin fought desperately against the transformed employees. Their inhuman strength was overwhelming, and I could hear his screams as they began to tear him apart. But his sacrifice had given me the opening I needed. The altar's surface was slick with blood, but I could feel the protective wards carved into my skin burning like brands. They were keeping the corruption at bay, allowing me to get close enough to begin carving the counter symbols into the stone. My knife blade scraped against the altar's surface, leaving thin lines that immediately filled with blood. But as I carved the first protective symbol, the chanting faltered. The blood flow slowed, and the sickly light from the walls began to dim. That's when I felt the hand on my shoulder. One of the transformed figures had reached the altar. Its grip was like ice, and I could feel the corruption trying to flow into me through its touch. But the protective scars on my arm flared with heat, and the creature recoiled with a shriek. I kept carving, racing against time as more of the transformed figures closed in. Austin's screams had stopped, but I could still hear the wet sounds of what they were doing to him. The altar was fighting back, trying to heal the symbols I was cutting into its surface, but I was making progress. 3 symbols. 4. 5. The chanting stopped completely as the 6th symbol was completed. The blood flow reversed, pouring back into the channels in the walls. The transformed figures collapsed, their borrowed humanity returning in their final moments. But the altar wasn't destroyed. It was only contained, the ritual disrupted but not broken. I could feel the ancient hunger still pulsing beneath the stone, waiting for another chance to feed. I looked around the cavern, at the bodies of the corporate employees and the remains of Austin Chevalier. His journal lay open nearby, its pages stained with blood, and I could see notes about other ritual sites throughout the city. This wasn't the only altar. There were others, and they were all connected. The underground system was still compromised, and the blood was still flowing. I had bought time, nothing more. The real battle was just beginning. Day 3. I emerged from the Meridian Building's basement into a Seattle I no longer recognized. The city's heart had burst open like a ruptured artery, drowning the streets in arterial crimson that reached the second-story windows of Pioneer Square's historic buildings. What had been a network of isolated ritual sites 12 hours ago was now a unified flooding system, connecting every tunnel, every storm drain, every basement into one massive summoning ground. The morning sky was the color of old blood, reflecting the crimson deluge that had transformed downtown into a lake of ichor. Pike Place Market was completely submerged, its neon signs flickering beneath the surface like dying stars. The Space Needle stood isolated on Queen and Hill, one of the few landmarks still visible above the floodline. I waded through the waist-deep blood toward the evacuation zone that Leo Damors had established in the old Kingdome parking structure. The elevated concrete platform was one of the few areas still above the flood line, and I could see the orange glow of emergency flares cutting through the crimson mist that rose from the streets below. The survivors had gathered there, maybe 200 people from a city of nearly 750,000. Most were tourists who had been staying in the hotels on higher ground, plus a handful of locals who had heeded the early warnings. Leo had organized them into work crews, rationing supplies and maintaining the makeshift shelters they'd constructed from salvaged materials. "Jeremy!" Leo's voice carried across the platform as I climbed the access ramp. "Thank God you're alive. We heard the explosion from the Meridian building." "Austin didn't make it," I said, showing him the blood-stained journal. "But he bought us time. The downtown altar is contained, but there are others. The whole system is connected." Leo's face was grim as he studied Austin's notes. At 62, he had spent 40 years building his Pioneer Square antique shop into a neighborhood institution, becoming an informal leader who knew everyone and everything in the historic district. Now he was applying those same organizational skills to keeping the survivors alive. "We've been monitoring the emergency bands," he said, leading me to a battery-powered radio setup. "The flooding isn't just downtown. It's spreading through the underground transit system, following the natural drainage patterns. Belltown, Capitol Hill, even parts of Fremont are reporting blood in their storm drains." I looked out over the crimson lake that had swallowed the city center. The blood wasn't still. It moved with purpose, flowing in patterns that suggested vast currents beneath the surface. Occasionally, something would break the surface, creating ripples that spread outward in perfect circles. The spawn were multiplying, using the flooded underground as a breeding ground. "How long do we have?" I asked. "The radio went silent from the eastern evacuation centers about an hour ago," Leo said. "Either they've moved to higher ground or—" He didn't finish the sentence. That's when Samuel arrived, emerging from the lower levels of the parking structure with his maintenance crew. My cousin was covered in blood and sewage, his city worker's uniform torn and stained. He carried a clipboard that held architectural drawings of the underground system, covered with his own annotations in red ink. "The tunnels are completely flooded," he reported. "But I've found something. There are 12 main drainage confluences under the city, points where multiple systems connect. If we can seal those junction points, we might be able to isolate the flooding, prevent it from spreading to the suburbs." I studied the drawings, comparing them to Austin's journal entries. The ritual sites weren't random. They had been placed at strategic points throughout the underground network, positioned to maximize the flow of blood through the city's infrastructure. "It's not just about drainage," I realized. The corporation used the city's own systems against it. Every time Seattle expanded, every new tunnel or building foundation, they were creating channels for the ritual. The blood isn't just flooding. It's following a pattern, a massive summoning circle that encompasses the entire metropolitan area. "Then we need to break the circle," Leo said. "Disrupt the pattern before it's complete." "The junction points," Samuel said, pointing to his drawings. "If we can collapse the main confluences, we can break the connections between the ritual sites. But it would require coordinated demolition at multiple locations simultaneously." I looked around the platform at the survivors, office workers, shopkeepers, tourists, a few city employees like Samuel. We had no heavy equipment, no military support, no way to communicate with the outside world. But we had something the corporation hadn't counted on: knowledge of the protective wards, and people willing to sacrifice themselves to use it. "I can get to the junction points," I said. "The protective scars my grandfather carved into me, they let me get close to the ritual sites without being transformed. But I'll need teams to help with the demolition." "I'll take the International District Confluence," Samuel said immediately. "I know those tunnels better than anyone. And I'll coordinate from here," Leo added. "We have enough people to hit 3 or 4 sites simultaneously. But Jeremy, you need to understand, if we collapse those tunnels, anyone down there isn't coming back up." The weight of that settled over us like a physical presence. We were talking about suicide missions, about sending people into the blood-flooded underground with no chance of survival. But as I looked out over the crimson lake that had swallowed our city, I realized we didn't have a choice. Over the next hour, we organized the survivors into demolition teams. Leo had found cases of construction explosives in the parking structure's maintenance areas. Seattle's constant construction had left plenty of resources for those who knew where to look. Samuel's crew provided technical expertise, while I shared everything I had learned about the protective wards and the corporation's ritual network. The plan was simple in its desperation. Teams would enter the flooded tunnels at 3 different points, following the drainage maps to reach the main confluences. Each team would plant explosives at the junction points, then attempt to escape before the charges detonated simultaneously. The coordinated collapse would sever the connections between ritual sites, breaking the summoning circle before it could be completed. Remember, I told the teams as we prepared to descend into the crimson flood, the blood will try to transform you. It's not just liquid, it's part of the ritual, and it wants to make you part of it too. The protective symbols I've drawn on your equipment should help, but don't trust them completely. If you feel the corruption taking hold, get out immediately. We had painted the protective wards from my grandfather's journal onto every piece of equipment, every explosive device, every tool we carried. The symbols seemed to repel the blood, creating small areas of clarity in the crimson chaos. But I could feel the ancient hunger testing those protections, looking for weaknesses. The first team descended into the flooded Pioneer Square Transit Tunnel, led by Maria Santos, a structural engineer who had been downtown for a conference. The second team, headed by David Kim, a local firefighter, took the route through the flooded basements toward the Denny Triangle confluence. Samuel's team would approach the International District Junction through the storm drain system. I went alone to the most dangerous target, the Central Library confluence, where the oldest tunnel systems intersected beneath the city's heart. Austin's journal had indicated this was the primary nexus point, the location where the corporation had placed their most powerful ritual anchor. The descent into the flooded library basement was like entering the digestive system of some massive creature. The blood was deeper here, reaching above my chest, and it moved with muscular contractions that suggested something vast breathing beneath the surface. The protective wards carved into my skin burned like brands, the only thing keeping the corruption at bay. The basement levels of the library extended far below the official building plans, connecting to natural cave systems that predated the city's construction. I followed the flow of blood through corridors lined with server equipment and climate control systems, all of it submerged and sparking with electrical shorts that created strange patterns of light in the crimson darkness. The central confluence was a natural cavern that had been expanded into a vast underground chamber. Ritual channels carved into the stone floor directed the blood flow from dozens of feeder tunnels, creating a whirlpool pattern that spiraled toward a central drain. The drain itself was covered with a grating made of what looked like bone and metal, inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. But the chamber wasn't empty. Floating in the blood whirlpool were dozens of spawn, the transformed victims of the ritual, their pale bodies moving with the current like jellyfish in a crimson sea. They were connected to each other by tendrils of corrupted tissue, forming a living network that pulsed with the rhythm of the ritual. I planted the explosive charges around the chamber's support pillars, working quickly as the spawn began to notice my presence. The protective wards were keeping them at bay, but I could feel their hunger pressing against the barriers like a physical weight. The symbols on my skin were burning now, the protection wearing thin under the concentrated corruption. The radio crackled with reports from the other teams. Maria's group had reached the Pioneer Square confluence but encountered heavy resistance from spawn clusters. David's team was in position at Denny Triangle, but 2 of his people had been transformed during the approach. Samuel's voice came through clearly. International district charges are placed. Standing by for synchronized detonation. All teams, this is Jeremy. Charges set at Central Library. Initiating countdown on my mark. I began the 30-second timer sequence, then started swimming toward the exit tunnel. The spawn were moving faster now, their network contracting like a closing fist. Several of them broke away from the main cluster, their black eyes fixed on me with predatory intelligence. Mark, all charges live. The swim to the exit felt like hours compressed into seconds. Behind me, I could hear the spawn closing in, their inhuman voices joining in a chant that made the blood around me vibrate with harmonic frequencies. The protective wards were failing, the corruption seeping through the cracks in their defense. I reached the tunnel junction just as the first explosions shook the underground. The shock wave traveled through the blood like a physical blow, and I felt the ancient ritual network begin to collapse. The spawn's chanting turned to screams as their connection to the summoning circle was severed. But the central library charges hadn't detonated yet. I turned back to see the spawn cluster surrounding the explosive devices, their corrupted bodies forming a protective barrier around the charges. They were trying to prevent the detonation, to keep their nexus point intact. Without the central library collapse, the ritual network would survive, diminished but still functional. There was only one way to ensure the charges detonated properly. I swam back toward the chamber, pulling the backup detonator from my equipment belt. The spawn turned toward me as I approached, their network contracting to crush me between their bodies. But the protective scars on my arms were burning white-hot now, and the corruption couldn't quite reach me. I pressed the detonator as the spawn closed in. The explosion was deafening, turning the blood around me into a crimson shockwave that slammed me against the tunnel wall. The chamber collapsed, tons of concrete and stone crashing down to seal the confluence permanently. The spawn's screams cut off abruptly as their network was severed, their bodies dissolving back into ordinary blood. I floated in the sudden silence, my ears ringing from the explosion. The radio was crackling with reports from the other teams. Successful detonations at all target points, the ritual network broken, the blood floods beginning to recede as the summoning circle lost its power. But as I swam toward the surface, I could hear Leo's voice over the radio, strained with grief and exhaustion. "Jeremy, if you can hear this, Samuel's team didn't make it out. The international district collapsed. They were caught in the tunnels when the charges went off." I broke the surface in the flooded Pioneer Square, gasping for air that still tasted of blood and metal. The level was dropping, the crimson lake draining back into the underground through the severed network. But the victory felt hollow, paid for with the lives of people who had trusted me to find a better way. By the time I reached the evacuation platform, the blood had receded enough to reveal the devastation below. Downtown Seattle was a ruin of collapsed buildings and scarred concrete, the streets carved with channel patterns that would never fully heal. The ritual had been stopped, but the city would never be the same. Leo met me at the platform's edge, his face showing the weight of our losses. "The other teams made it out," he said. "Maria's crew, David's people, they're alive. But we lost 12 people total, including Samuel." I looked out over the ruined city, at the survivors gathering their belongings for the long journey to safety. The protective wards had worked, the ritual network was broken, but the cost had been higher than I had imagined. My cousin was gone, along with 11 others who had volunteered to descend into the blood-flooded underground. "The corporation's files," I said, showing Leo the salvage documents from Austin's journal. "There are other cities, other ritual sites. This wasn't the only location they were preparing." Leo nodded grimly. "Then we have work to do. The people who survived this need to know what happened, need to understand the signs to watch for. We can't let this happen again." As the survivors began their exodus from the ruined city, I carved the protective symbols into the concrete platform where we had made our stand. Future generations would need to know what had happened here, would need the tools to fight back if the corporation tried to complete their ritual elsewhere. The blood had stopped flowing, but the war was far from over. Day 4, I found Samuel's body in the International District confluence at dawn, when the blood had receded enough to reveal what the explosion had done to the tunnels below. The protective wards carved into my skin were still burning, but now they felt like brands of guilt rather than salvation. My cousin lay crushed beneath concrete and twisted metal, his city maintenance uniform torn and blood-stained, his clipboard still clutched in his dead hands. But it was what surrounded his body that made me understand the true horror of what we had unleashed. The explosion had cracked open the tunnel walls, revealing chambers that predated Seattle's construction by centuries. Ancient stone foundations carved with symbols that matched the ones in Grandpa Pierre's journals. But these were different, older, more elaborate, and filled with dried blood that had been there long before the corporation began their ritual. Samuel's fresh blood had flowed into these carved channels, mixing with the ancient stains to create patterns that pulsed with sickly light. The protective wards my grandfather had documented weren't just barriers against the ritual. They were part of it. I pulled Samuel's body from the rubble, my hands shaking as I realized what his sacrifice had accomplished. The confluence point was destroyed, yes, but the demolition had exposed the foundation stones that the original settlers had tried to hide. The corporation hadn't corrupted the protective wards. They had been designed from the beginning to channel blood into the ancient summoning system. Seattle had been built on a lie. Back at the evacuation platform, I spread Grandpa Pierre's journals alongside Austin's corporate documents and Samuel's architectural drawings. The survivors gathered around as I traced the connections between the three sets of information, revealing the scope of the deception that had claimed our city. The first European settlers didn't just find an empty harbor, I explained, pointing to entries in my grandfather's journal. They found an established ritual site, a summoning ground that had been used by the indigenous peoples for generations. But they didn't understand what they were dealing with. Leo leaned over the documents, his face grim. The protective wards weren't protective at all. They were focusing elements, designed to concentrate the ritual energy at specific points throughout the city. Every expansion, every new building, every infrastructure project. They were all part of a massive summoning circle that's been growing for over a century. I opened Austin's journal to a page filled with corporate timeline charts. The Meridian Corporation didn't start this ritual. They inherited it from the original developers, who inherited it from the territorial government, who inherited it from the first settlers. It's been passed down through Seattle's power structure for generations, with each group adding their own layer to the summoning network. Maria Santos, the structural engineer who had survived the Pioneer Square demolition, studied the architectural drawings with growing horror. The building foundations, she said, the way they're positioned throughout the city, they're not following standard urban planning principles. They're following the ritual pattern. Every major construction project in Seattle's history has been part of the summoning circle, I confirmed. The Space Needle, the Kingdom, the underground transit system, they were all positioned to channel energy toward the central altar network. The corporation was just the latest group to take control of the ritual. David Kim, the firefighter who had led the Denny Triangle team, looked up from Austin's corporate documents. If this is true, then stopping the immediate ritual won't end the threat. The infrastructure is still there, the foundations are still connected. Someone else could pick up where the corporation left off. The weight of that realization settled over the survivors like a physical presence. We had thought we were fighting a corporate conspiracy, but we had actually been battling a ritual that was woven into the very fabric of the city. Every street, every building, every tunnel was part of the summoning network. There's more, I said, opening the final section of my grandfather's journal. Pierre Leduc wasn't just a folklorist documenting local legends. He was a member of a secret society called the Watchers, people who had been monitoring the ritual's progress for decades. They knew what was coming, and they tried to prepare defenses. I showed them the pages I had never fully understood before, detailed plans for counter-rituals, protective symbols that could be carved into the city's infrastructure to disrupt the summoning network. But the plans were incomplete, missing crucial elements that would make them functional. The Watchers were infiltrated, I continued. The corporation had people inside their organization, feeding them false information and stealing their research. By the time my grandfather realized what was happening, it was too late to stop the ritual completely. All he could do was prepare someone to continue the fight. I rolled up my sleeves, revealing the scars that had protected me throughout the crisis. These aren't just protective wards. They're a key, a way to access the counter-ritual information that the Watchers hid throughout the city. My grandfather carved them into me when I was a child, but he died before he could explain what they were for. Leo studied the scars, comparing them to the symbols in the journals. Can you use them to complete the counter-ritual? I don't know. The Watchers hid their research in multiple locations throughout the city, using the same infrastructure that the corporation was using for their ritual. But accessing that information requires someone with the proper markings, someone who can get close to the ritual sites without being corrupted. That afternoon, I made my way back into the ruined downtown, following the patterns in my grandfather's journal toward the hidden Watcher caches. The blood had receded, but the city was still scarred by the ritual's effects. The streets were carved with channel patterns that would never fully heal, and the buildings showed stress fractures that followed the lines of the summoning network. The first cache was hidden in the basement of the Smith Tower, Seattle's original skyscraper. The building had been damaged in the flooding, its lower floors gutted by the blood flow, but the Watcher vault had survived. It was protected by symbols that matched the scars on my arms, and when I pressed my hands against the stone seal, it opened to reveal a chamber filled with documents and artifacts. The Watchers had been more organized than I had imagined. They had mapped the entire ritual network, identified the key nodes and energy flows, and developed a comprehensive plan to disrupt the summoning circle. But their counter-ritual required specific actions at precise locations, and it had to be performed by someone with the proper bloodline, someone whose ancestors had been part of the original indigenous rituals. I wasn't just carrying my grandfather's protective wards. I was carrying the genetic memory of the people who had first used this land for ritual purposes, the knowledge needed to turn the city's infrastructure against itself. The second cache was in the Pike Place Market, hidden beneath the fish-throwing vendors in a sub-basement that had been sealed for decades. The Watchers had stored ritual implements there, carved stones, metal vessels, and tools that had been blessed by the original inhabitants of the region. Each item was inscribed with symbols that corresponded to specific locations in the city, a mapping system that would allow the counter-ritual to be performed with precision. But as I gathered the artifacts, I realized the true cost of what I was planning. The counter-ritual wouldn't just disrupt the corporation's summoning network, it would collapse the entire foundation system that Seattle had been built on. Every building, every street, every tunnel would be affected as the ritual energy was redirected and neutralized. The city would survive, but it would never be the same. Millions of people would lose their homes, their businesses, their entire way of life. The economic and social disruption would be catastrophic, affecting not just Seattle but the entire Pacific Northwest region. I found the third cache in the ruins of the original Skid Road, the logging district where Seattle had first been established. The Watchers had hidden their final research there, in a vault that required all 3 sets of artifacts to open. When I combined the documents, implements, and my grandfather's genetic markers, the seal dissolved to reveal the complete counter-ritual instructions. The ritual was complex, requiring actions at 7 key nodes throughout the city's infrastructure. Each node corresponded to a major period in Seattle's development, from the original indigenous settlement to the modern corporate era. The counter-ritual would trace the city's history in reverse, undoing the layers of summoning energy that had been built up over the centuries. But it required a blood sacrifice at each node, not just any blood, but the blood of someone who carried the genetic markers of the original ritual participants. The Watchers had prepared for this, creating a network of families who carried the necessary bloodlines. But over the generations, most of those families had died out or moved away. I was the last one left. As I studied the final instructions, I realized that my grandfather hadn't just prepared me to fight the corporation's ritual. He had prepared me to sacrifice myself to save the city. The scars on my arms weren't just protective wards. They were ritual markings that would allow my blood to power the counter-ritual, to turn the city's infrastructure against the summoning network. 7 nodes, 7 blood sacrifices, 1 person. I would die long before the ritual was complete, but the counter-ritual was designed to continue after my death, using the genetic memory stored in my blood to guide the process. The city would survive, but the cost would be the last living link to the original inhabitants who had first used this land for ritual purposes. That evening, I returned to the evacuation platform with the complete counter-ritual instructions. The survivors gathered around as I explained what I had discovered, what would be required to permanently end the threat. The corporation was just the latest group to use the ritual network, I said. If we don't destroy the entire system, someone else will eventually try to complete the summoning. The counter-ritual is the only way to ensure that never happens. Leo studied the instructions with growing understanding. But you'll die in the process. The blood sacrifice has to come from someone with the proper genetic markers. I'm the only one left who qualifies. Maria looked up from the architectural plans. What about the city? What happens to Seattle when the counter-ritual is complete? The foundation systems will collapse, but in a controlled way. The buildings will survive, but they'll need to be rebuilt on new foundations. The underground networks will be sealed permanently. It'll take years to recover, but the city will be free of the ritual influence. The survivors were quiet as they absorbed the implications. We were talking about the complete transformation of one of America's major cities, the displacement of millions of people, the destruction of an economic center that affected the entire region. There has to be another way, David said. Some alternative that doesn't require your death. I shook my head. The Watchers spent decades looking for alternatives. This is the only way to permanently break the ritual network. And it has to be done soon. The corporation's ritual may have been disrupted, but the infrastructure is still active. The summoning energy is building up again, looking for a new outlet. As if to confirm my words, the evening sky began to darken with unnatural clouds. The blood had receded from the streets, but the ritual scars remained, and they were beginning to glow with the same sickly light I had seen in the underground chambers. How long do we have? Leo asked. I consulted my grandfather's calculations, comparing them to the current energy levels. Maybe a week before the system reaches critical mass again. After that, the ritual will complete itself automatically, whether there's anyone controlling it or not. The survivors began to disperse, some to gather supplies for the evacuation, others to document what had happened for future generations. But Leo remained, studying the counter-ritual instructions with the same intensity he had once applied to running his antique shop. Samuel died believing he was helping to save the city, he said finally. Are you sure this is what he would have wanted? I looked out over the ruined downtown, at the scarred streets and damaged buildings that bore witness to the ritual's power. My cousin had given his life to break the corporation's control over the summoning network, but his sacrifice would be meaningless if the ritual was allowed to continue under new management. Samuel died protecting the people he cared about, I said. The counter-ritual is the only way to ensure that his sacrifice wasn't in vain. Leo nodded slowly. Then we'll help you prepare. The city deserves to know what you're doing for them, even if they never fully understand the cost. As the survivors prepared for the final phase of our battle against the ritual network, I carved Samuel's name into the protective symbols on the platform. His blood had joined the ancient summoning circle, but his memory would endure as a reminder of the price of resistance. The counter-ritual would begin at dawn, and by sunset, either Seattle would be free of the ritual's influence, or the city would be consumed by forces that had been building for over a century. The last descendant of the original ritual participants would face the choice between personal survival and the salvation of a city that had been built on ancient foundations of blood and sacrifice. Day 5. If you're reading this, then the counter-ritual worked. The blood-stained pages of this journal are the last testament of Jeremy Leduc, tour guide, reluctant historian, and the final guardian of secrets that should have died with the first settlers. I'm writing this at dawn on the 5th day, before I begin the sequence that will either save Seattle or damn it forever. The ritual scars on my arms are burning like molten metal, responding to the energy that's building beneath the city. The corporation's network may be broken, but the ancient foundations are still there, still hungry, still pulling power from the bloodlines that have fed them for over a century. I can feel it in my bones. The summoning circle is trying to complete itself, with or without human guidance. The survivors have evacuated to the surrounding hills, carrying copies of the Watcher's research and instructions for rebuilding the city once the counter-ritual is complete. Leo Damors leads them now, his organizational skills turned toward preserving the knowledge that will be needed to prevent this from happening again. Maria Santos has the architectural plans for new foundations that won't follow the ritual patterns. David Kim carries the emergency protocols for managing the controlled collapse of the underground systems. But I remain in the ruined city, alone with the tools of my ancestors and the weight of a sacrifice that was planned before I was born. The 7 nodes of the counter-ritual are spread throughout Seattle's infrastructure, each one corresponding to a major period in the city's development. I will visit them in reverse chronological order, undoing the layers of summoning energy that have been built up over the centuries. My blood will power the reversal, turning the city's ritual network against itself. Node 7. The Corporate Core, 2020s. I began at the Meridian Building, where Austin Chevalier had died trying to disrupt the modern phase of the ritual. The basement altar was still there, its black stone surface cracked by the protective symbols I had carved into it. But the cracks were healing, the ancient stone trying to repair itself with blood that seeped up from the deeper foundations. I pressed my hands against the altar, feeling the ritual scars on my arms align with the symbols carved into the stone. The connection was immediate and agonizing. My blood began to flow into the carved channels, but instead of feeding the summoning circle, it carried the counter-ritual patterns that would disrupt the corporate network. The altar cracked completely, splitting down the middle with a sound like breaking bones. The corporate ritual nodes throughout the city began to fail, their energy redirected into the counter-ritual sequence. I could feel the network collapsing, the modern additions to the summoning circle falling away like shed skin. But the effort cost me. By the time I left the Meridian Building, my hands were shaking and my vision was blurred. The blood loss was already affecting me, and I had 6 more nodes to complete. Node 6. The Transportation Hub, 1990s. The next node was in the heart of the underground transit system, where the corporation had placed ritual amplifiers to channel energy through the subway tunnels. The platform was still flooded with ankle-deep blood, but it was ordinary blood now, not the ritual-charged ichor that had spawned the creatures. I carved the counter-ritual symbols into the platform's concrete, using my own blood to fill the channels. The amplifiers began to overload, their electronic components sparking and smoking as the ritual energy was reversed. The transportation network that had spread the corporation's influence throughout the city was now carrying the counter-ritual in the opposite direction. The platform began to crack, stress fractures spreading through the concrete as the ritual foundations beneath it started to collapse. I barely made it to the surface before the entire station caved in, sealing the transit tunnels permanently. Node 5. The Development Boom, 1980s. The third node was in the Columbia Center, Seattle's tallest building and a symbol of the city's economic growth. The corporate developers who had built it had placed a ritual focus in the foundation, using the building's height to broadcast summoning energy across the metropolitan area. I found the focus in the building's subbasement, a carved stone pillar that extended deep into the earth. The symbols on its surface were a mixture of corporate sigils and ancient markings, representing the marriage of modern ambition with primordial hunger. Carving the counter-ritual into the pillar was like cutting into living flesh. The stone bled, and the blood tried to corrupt the symbols I was creating. But the scars on my arms were burning bright enough to keep the corruption at bay, and I managed to complete the pattern before the pillar cracked and fell. The Columbia Center swayed but remained standing as its ritual foundation collapsed. The development boom energy was redirected into the counter-ritual, and I could feel the city's skyline losing its supernatural influence. Node 4. The Infrastructure Expansion, 1960s. The fourth node was in the original Space Needle, built for the 1962 World's Fair. The structure had been positioned to act as a massive antenna, broadcasting the ritual energy across the Pacific Northwest. The fair's planners had been watchers, trying to create a counter-ritual broadcast, but they had been infiltrated by the corporation's predecessors. I climbed the needle's interior structure, following maintenance ladders to the broadcast equipment at the top. The ritual focus was hidden inside the rotating restaurant mechanism, a crystalline formation that had been growing for decades, fed by the energy of millions of visitors. Breaking the crystal required pressing my scarred hands directly against its surface. The feedback was overwhelming. I could feel the accumulated psychic energy of every person who had ever visited the Space Needle. Their hopes and dreams twisted into fuel for the summoning circle. The crystal shattered, and the Space Needle's ritual broadcast ceased. The infrastructure expansion energy joined the counter-ritual, and the city's supernatural influence began to contract toward its historic core. Node 3. The Military-Industrial Complex, 1940s. The fifth node was in the old Boeing plant, where the corporation's predecessors had used wartime production to expand the ritual network. The aircraft manufacturing had been a cover for creating ritual components, metal frameworks that had been installed in buildings throughout the city. The ritual focus was in the plant's foundry, where molten metal had been used to create ritual implements for decades. The entire facility was a massive summoning tool, its assembly lines designed to channel energy into the growing network. I found the central crucible, still warm despite the plant's abandonment. The metal inside was not ordinary steel. It was an alloy that had been created using ritual processes, designed to conduct summoning energy with perfect efficiency. I carved the counter-ritual symbols into the crucible's surface, my blood hissing as it touched the superheated metal. The ritual alloy began to break down, its supernatural properties neutralized by the counter-ritual patterns. The military-industrial energy was redirected, and the city's ritual network lost another layer of power. Node 2. The Great Depression Expansion, 1930s. The sixth node was in the old Hooverville, where the city's desperate poor had been used as unwitting ritual components during the economic collapse. The corporation's predecessors had taken advantage of the social chaos to expand the summoning network, using the suffering of the homeless as fuel for their rituals. The ritual focus was buried beneath what had once been the largest shantytown on the West Coast. I dug through decades of accumulated debris, following the energy patterns until I found the carved stone chamber that had been hidden beneath the temporary shelters. The chamber was filled with personal belongings, photographs, letters, children's toys, all of them arranged in ritual patterns and stained with blood. The corporation's predecessors had been harvesting the life force of the desperate, using their deaths to power the summoning circle. I carved the counter-ritual symbols into the chamber walls, my blood mixing with the stains left by the Hooverville victims. The Depression-era energy was liberated, and I could feel the spirits of the dead finally finding peace as their suffering was transformed into protection for the living. Node 1. The Original Settlement, 1850s. The final node was where Seattle had begun, in the original settlement that had been built on top of the indigenous ritual site. This was the heart of the summoning circle, the foundation that all subsequent layers had been built upon. The site was beneath Pioneer Square, in natural caves that had been used for ritual purposes for thousands of years. The first European settlers had found the caves already prepared, carved with symbols that they had mistaken for decorative art. They had built their town on top of the ritual site, unknowingly becoming part of a summoning circle that predated their arrival by centuries. I descended into the caves through a crack that had been opened by the recent flooding. The walls were covered with symbols that matched the scars on my arms, but these were the originals, carved by the indigenous peoples who had first used this land for ritual purposes. At the center of the cave system was an altar made of natural stone, worn smooth by centuries of use. The blood stains on its surface were layers deep, representing generations of ritual sacrifice. But these weren't the evil rituals of the corporation. They were protective ceremonies, designed to keep something ancient and hungry contained beneath the earth. I finally understood the truth. The indigenous peoples hadn't been summoning something, they had been keeping it bound. The European settlers had disrupted the protective rituals, and the corporation had spent over a century trying to complete the summoning that had been accidentally begun. The thing beneath Seattle was waking up, and it was hungry. I placed my hands on the ancient altar, feeling the ritual scars align with the original symbols. The counter-ritual reached its climax, all 7 nodes of energy converging on this single point. My blood flowed into the carved channels, not to feed the summoning circle, but to restore the protective barriers that had been broken so long ago. The ancient hunger pressed against the barriers, testing them for weakness. But the counter-ritual held, reinforced by the energy that had been redirected from the corporate network. The thing beneath the city was contained once again, bound by protective symbols that had been restored to their original purpose. But the effort was killing me. I could feel my life force draining away, my blood becoming part of the protective matrix that would keep the city safe. The ritual scars on my arms were burning away, their energy consumed by the counter-ritual. As I lay dying on the ancient altar, I carved a final set of symbols into the stone. Not ritual markings, but a message for future generations. The location of the Watcher's research caches, the identity of the families who carried the protective bloodlines, the warning signs that would indicate if the barriers were weakening. The earth shook as the counter-ritual reached completion. Throughout the city, the ritual foundations collapsed in controlled sequences, their energy redirected into the protective barriers. Buildings swayed but remained standing, their supernatural influences neutralized. The underground networks sealed themselves, preventing future access to the ritual sites. Seattle survived, but it was forever changed. The city that emerged from the ritual's destruction was built on ordinary foundations, powered by human ambition rather than ancient hunger. The supernatural influences that had guided its development for over a century were gone, replaced by mundane concerns and everyday problems. The survivors returned to find a city that looked the same but felt completely different. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over Seattle for generations was gone, replaced by a sense of freedom that most people couldn't quite identify. The ritual network was broken, its power dispersed harmlessly into the earth. But the price had been paid in blood, my blood, and the blood of everyone who had died fighting the corporation's ritual. Samuel's sacrifice, Austin's courage, Leo's leadership, all of it had been necessary to break the cycle that had claimed the city for so long. I carved their names into the altar beside my own, a memorial to the people who had given their lives to free Seattle from its supernatural bondage. The protective barriers would endure as long as the city existed, powered by the sacrifice of those who had chosen to fight rather than flee. The earth weeps venom where the ritual sites once stood, but the tears are tears of relief rather than pain. The ancient hunger is contained, the summoning circle is broken, and the city is free. The wards are buried in rubble, but they endure. Seattle endures. Final note found with the journal. This journal was discovered in the ruins of the Pioneer Square cave system by the Seattle Reconstruction Authority in 2026. The identity of the author has been confirmed through genetic analysis of blood samples found at the 7 ritual sites. Jeremy Leduc's sacrifice made possible the restoration of Seattle as a city free from supernatural influence. The protective barriers established by the counter-ritual remain active. Regular monitoring by the Watcher's successors indicates that the ancient entity beneath the city remains contained. The ritual sites have been sealed permanently, and new construction follows the safe foundation patterns developed by the survivors. This journal serves as both a historical record and a warning. The signs described by Jeremy Leduc have been observed in other cities across the Pacific Northwest. The ritual network that consumed Seattle was not unique. It was part of a larger pattern that continues to threaten communities throughout the region. The war against the ancient hunger continues, but Seattle stands as proof that victory is possible. The city that emerged from the ritual's destruction is stronger, cleaner, and more human than what came before. The price was high, but the freedom it purchased will endure for generations. Let this journal serve as both memorial and manual for future guardians. The earth may weep venom, but the wards endure. Dr. Maria Santos, Chief Architect, Seattle Reconstruction Authority. Leo Damores, Director, Pacific Northwest Watchers Society. David Kim, Emergency Response Coordinator, Regional Supernatural Containment Unit.